Thank you, Chair. And in fact, it's our colleague in the House of Lords, Lord Carlisle, KC, who often says we have a tough law, but with a kind face. And I think that plays into the points that the panel has just made. I should declare interest for the sake of the record. They're non-financial, but I'm on the board of Living and Dying Well and a patron of Right to Life, and I'm a patron of several hospices. But my question isn't so much really about our jurisdiction, it's about other jurisdictions, if I may, Chair. 7.6 billion people in the world live in jurisdictions where there are prohibitions or protections. 100 million live in jurisdictions where the law has changed incrementally. And in over half of those, this doesn't involve just assisted dying. I mean, it involves euthanasia in the terms that you just described. Can you tell us what protections and safeguards are in place? Because I think you will know that one of the significant concerns which has been raised in Parliament has been how will we protect the vulnerable, not least disabled people and the groups who are so strongly opposed to any changes in the law. Thank you.
I think it's worth noting that the eligibility criteria introduced at a certain point in time clearly don't remain static, and one sees that very clearly in Canada. So an initial legislation quite narrowly targeted to comply with the Supreme Court's judgment in Carter, focusing on reasonable foreseeability of death, expanded partly under judicial pressure, partly by political choice, quite rapidly with further expansion, all in a very short space of time. And to me, this suggests rather that this is not a stable state of affairs, and one's hope that one can limit the practice to a narrow set of persons for whom there are compelling considerations, I think, is ungrounded, and that practice in Canada in recent years strongly confirms that risk.
Can I just make sure I understand properly what's happened in Canada, Professor Eakins? So initially there was a statute quite narrowly drawn, is that correct?
In response, yes, as I understand,
in response to a decision of their constitutional court. But then it has been expanded in what way? By the legislature or by the courts?
By the legislature, but under judicial pressure. So the limitation to reasonable foreseeability of death was held, I believe, to be discriminatory against those who were in a long-term condition of suffering and disability, but not within reasonable foresight of death, however so defined. So it's a combination, and for my part, I think there's a slippery slope in clear evidence here, and the Supreme Court in Carter's lack of concern about that has proved to be unfounded. By which I mean that the problem has manifested itself and manifested quite clearly, and it's still a slippery slope in my view. If there's support along the way, if one's concern is that we're crossing a major moral legal threshold by allowing the intentional killing and assistance of intentional killing, then the fact that people get quite keen on this and expand the range of it, as they have in the Netherlands and in Belgium, as I understand it, isn't a reason to think, well, then there's no problem because the people are perfectly happy. It might be there's a problem precisely because they're getting used to this more expansive jurisdiction or this more expansive practice. I know the conversation's moved on to Article 2, and if you'll permit me, I'll say one or two things about that. I mean, my own view is that the practice one sees in the Netherlands and Belgium, and a law that made provision for assisted suicide would breach the requirements of Article 2. It's true that the Strasbourg Court clearly has not held that. The Mortier case, which my colleague referred to before, end of last year, involves a partial challenge, but not a frontal challenge to the lawfulness and convention terms of I believe it was Belgium's practice of euthanasia. But it seems to me there's a very strong argument that the state should be making provision to protect people from being killed. Now, Dr. Martin referred, and of course referred partly to the Canadian jurisprudence that takes up this argument that if we don't make provision for assisted suicide, then we are, or the state rather, is forcing people to kill themselves prematurely. I mean, that line of thought may have been aired, and it certainly wasn't approved by the courts, let alone and not by majority. And I think, with respect, it's an unpersuasive argument. The state is not forcing people to commit suicide by prescribing the assistance of suicide. On the contrary, it's discouraging the act in question and attempting to to avoid further instances of suicide. And I think there's a self-refuting character to the argument. We have to make it lawful for suicide to be assisted in order to discourage it or to minimise it. But we are also would be required by our duty under the Convention and basic morality to protect everyone's right to life and law, to stop those suicides as well. So I think the argument is uncompelling. It did find favour, of course, in the Supreme Court in Carter in Canada, which is important and warrants serious consideration. But to my mind, the argument does not make sense and should not be taken further by courts in Europe, which haven't, as I understand it, taken it further, and certainly not by the Parliament in the United Kingdom.
Mr. Bowen and then Mr. Strachan.
Yes, I just was in fact wanting to respond to the suggestion that the